Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of ClearHead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Change is inevitable, whether you're moving countries, going through a breakup, experiencing a restructure at work, or living with grief. One thing is for certain. Change can be daunting and anxiety-inducing if we aren't ready to face them. However, it's also important to recognize that change can be a huge opportunity to bring positivity into our lives, alongside hope, new experiences, and personal growth. In this episode, we are joined by change leadership expert Anne Bonney, who will share with us how we can embrace the discomfort of change and push through towards bigger and brighter opportunities. Anne is a two-time author and host of the hit podcast Dancing in the Discomfort Zone, which helps overwhelmed professionals build resilience in the discomfort of change. After 20 years of crushing it in the corporate and nonprofit sectors, she now uses her hard-earned experience in the workplace and fiery passion to help leaders tackle tough conversations and lead with emotional intelligence. Welcome, Anne.
Thanks. Great to be here with you, Dr. Angela.
Thanks, Anne. So what is the story behind you becoming a change expert? How does one become a change expert?
Yeah, well, as you might be able to hear, I'm from the United States. And when I was in second grade, I came home one day from school and there was my after school snack. And both my parents sat me and my brother down and they said, we're moving to Saudi Arabia. And so third grade and fourth grade were in Saudi. Fifth grade was in Egypt. Sixth through ninth grade was in Greece. And so I became a child that was used to change, used to new environments, used to being uncomfortable, not knowing the language, not knowing the culture. And I think that served me really well. And when I became a speaker for the first few years, I did a lot of different topics. And finally, I said, I need to zero in on something. And I was in the shower one day and I said, and you do change. Like that's, you've had tons of jobs and been to lots of different schools and lived in lots of different places and God only knows how many hairdos you've had. So I thought that maybe I'd have something to help people to get through change a little more easily.
Why do you think people struggle with change?
Well, our brains aren't built to change. Our brains like same. Same means safe. If we've survived it before, we'll probably survive it again. And so when we deal with unfamiliar situations where we don't know what the outcome's going to be, or situations where things go differently than we thought they were going to, our brains kind of freak out and start telling us all the things that are going to go wrong, which is really, really uncomfortable, as you all well know. So, that protective part of your brain that's trying to keep you alive, that's its job, doesn't like things to be different. And so we're really combating biology in trying to deal with change. So I love telling people that because it normalizes the discomfort that comes with change. So if you're one of those people that's like, I hate change, just leave it alone. It's because your brain's doing its job.
And so what have you learned, I guess, in your own life as well as in supporting others to change, to hack biology basically and override our underlying system on things that is trying to protect us?
Yeah. Well, and it comes down to what I call sassy back talk. Knowing that voice in our head is trying to keep us alive, but that voice that it is 100% risk averse. It doesn't know the difference between getting chased by a saber-toothed tiger and having a difficult conversation at work. It just doesn't know the difference, right? Any kind of stressor, any kind of new situation or unfamiliarity, it freaks out and starts telling you all the things that are going to go wrong. And so one of the strategies that I like to use is just recognizing that voice of doubt is a protective piece of our brain, and to say, okay, cool, brain, thank you. I appreciate it. And this is a situation where I think I can handle this. And understanding that that discomfort and that voice of doubt should merely be a speed bump to think about the situation a little bit more rather than a stop sign to stop you from moving forward. Unless there's a bus coming, then stop.
But from what I'm hearing is it sounds like you almost have to be confident that you would be able to deal with the change. But often change is in the context of something new. So how would I know that I could actually handle it? Maybe my brain is right. Maybe my brain is right in telling me that I can't handle this. How do I overcome that?
Yeah, you can't. This is the fun part about it, This is the fun part about being human, is we never truly know if the next step we take is going to be the right one. But resistance to change is the inability or the unwillingness to acknowledge that there may be an alternative outcome that's also good. Right? We get stuck on how we want this to go, and any, diversion from that outcome feels like, oh no, it went all wrong. Well, you've survived every worst day of your life. You have overcome a lot. And I've got a list in my drawer. I don't share it with friends, but in those moments of doubt, it's great to be able to look back and say, oh, I survived this. I overcame that. I figured that out when I messed it up. And by having that historical knowledge of, hey, you know what? I'm kind of awesome at this. I've got this. It allows you to build that confidence a little bit more. It's an ongoing process. And that voice of doubt is still, hammering away at you, which can be really challenging. But, being able to say, not only have I done a lot of things and overcome a lot of things in the past, but also if this doesn't go well, which it might not, I'll probably figure it out. That can help you to build that confidence as you try to move through change. And just again, recognizing it's not comfortable and you're not ever going to be sure. Aren't you glad you have me on the show?
And I guess, it's still kind of trying to contain what our brain is trying to tell us is this is a bad thing. You will overcome this bad thing. But part of your perspective is that actually let's take one step further and actually see the change as a positive thing. How do you sort of shift your mindset in that context?
And it's not, all those things that your brain's telling you could go wrong actually could go wrong, and it might not go well. And I think that realism is important, but also seeing that it could go well. One of the questions I like to ask myself when my brain's, throwing all that negativity at me is, okay, that's great. You're right, brain, that could happen. And what if this goes well? We don't ask ourselves that question very often. What if this goes really, really well? What if everything turns out okay? And by just kind of walking down that road for a minute, it takes the pressure off the likelihood of the negative outcome. And also, allows you to see some of the other possible positive outcomes. And the fact is, you never know how it's going to go until you get there.
Yeah.
And by moving through it and actually taking action, even small little actions, reaching out to a friend, asking a question, looking something up online, but when we start taking those little actions, we not only learn new things, because when we're just standing there swirling around in the anxiety, we're not learning anything. We're just swirling around in all the old information and all the fear of what could happen. But when we're actually moving through it and taking those little steps, not only are we learning new things and starting to see what else we might be able to do, but we're also building our self-efficacy, which is an incredible piece of a resilient human being, and incredible piece of building confidence. Self-efficacy is basically our belief that we can do something that matters, that our actions matter, that we can do something to make this situation a little better. We're not just riding around on a wrecking ball, running into things in life. And when we feel that ability to do something, we have hope. we kind of, when we don't feel like we have anything that we can do, it's a very hopeless, yucky feeling of like, I'm completely out of control here. But when we're willing to take small steps, again, it might even be asking a question. It might feel inconsequential. But when we take that small step, we start seeing another step and another step. And it just, we start moving. We want to make big, moves. We want to see the whole path, but that's just oftentimes not how it works when we're deep in the anxiety of what's going to happen here.
Yeah. And sometimes time in itself is such a powerful factor in letting things play out, right? And seeing how that change evolves. One of the things that came to my mind when you were speaking was also in the context of gratitude. You might have a terrible day, but actually if you take a few minutes to sit down and go, well, what's one thing I could be grateful for, even in this terrible day? And so to your point, it's like, yes, it might be anxiety inducing with all the change, but if you could just take a few minutes to write down what's one thing that could be a positive thing that could come out of this change, often.
And I think that's possible. A really important point, because one of the things that I talk about is the fact that seemingly contradictory emotions can exist together. You can be frustrated about the change and still be on board. You can be afraid of how it's going to turn out and still believe it's a good idea. And still see the positive, so allowing yourself to live in that place where both of those emotions exist also makes it feel like, okay, cool, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm allowed to be frustrated. I'm allowed to be angry. I'm allowed to feel loss. And I can still move through this at the same time. That is an important place to be when we're in what I call the discomfort zone, in that place where I'm like, I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't like this. That's the discomfort zone.
Yeah. And I think that's such a powerful thing to highlight, which is that you can have conflicting emotions and thoughts, and both can simultaneously be true at the same time. And it's you as a human being learning how to kind of sit within sometimes some of these contradictions and then working your way through them. You sort of mentioned that, that part of what will help an individual then become resilient is this self-efficacy. What other factors do we have to develop to become a resilient human being? How do you define resilience?
The term I love, resilience, humans are innately resilient. We will bounce back. The question is, how terrible is it going to be on the way back up, right? And the term I love to use is mental toughness, because what that is resilience, which we all have, plus confidence in our resilience, right? Which makes the terrible factor lower a little bit. And the four sort of pillars of a mentally tough person are self-regulation, our social connection, our forward momentum and understanding sort of where I'm going and why I'm doing this, and also adaptability to change. And we already talked about one of these under the social regulation piece, which is managing your self-talk. Hearing that voice of doubt, understanding where it's coming from, but knowing that that's not the full truth. I talked to a guy who was a double Ironman competitor. He had done it like 7 times, and the Ironman enough is hard enough. But a double Ironman is a 5-mile swim, 224-mile bike, and a 52-mile run or something like that, like an insane amount of distance. And there's a lot of time in those events to doubt yourself. And what he said was, I learned to talk to myself instead of listen to myself. And I think that is so important, because people say, eliminate negative self-talk. Well, good luck with that. Like, I haven't figured out how to make it go away. It's there. It just can't.
You have to replace it, right? Is what you're saying here.
Exactly. Have a conversation with it. Yeah.
I'm curious now, as you mentioned, you've talked to many different people and they've kind of shared with you their version of resilience. What have you learned that's common between all these people that you've spoken to?
I think the biggest one is the ability to see a positive alternative, like not being clinging to one possible way this could turn out. When people are more open to how this could go, they're more willing and more psychologically flexible to see the possible positive outcomes. I think that's one of the keys. You know, when we're stuck on one way that something will always be, we're bound to be disappointed because as you said at the very beginning of this, change is inevitable. It's gonna happen. And it's funny how some of us as humans and in different situations, we expect things to stay the same. And we're just, even though we know that stuff's always gonna change. And so I always say the key to happiness is lowered expectations. And that sounds terrible and pessimistic. But what I mean is when reality is pointing to things not necessarily turning out the way you expect, shift the expectation. And mentally tough people are able to do that and say, okay, I need to shift this. I need to think about this a little bit differently on the fly as we're going, because reality is telling me this is going to go a little differently than I expected. So I think that's a big characteristic of people who are mentally tough.
I think one of the reasons it's sometimes hard to deviate from the path that we feel we should go down is because we've already invested so much in this path. I'm not sure if you've heard of the term sunk cost fallacy. You know, for example, for myself, like I was a medical doctor before I started Clearhead. You know, I sunk in a good 12 years of study in medicine. But for me, similar to you, I was always very excited about the possibility of something else that could be more impactful. And so it was okay for me to make that shift away from being a doctor and all the training I did to become a doctor to then run Clearhead so that I could provide mental health support at scale. And for me, what was at the back of my mind is it is more scary to regret what if than to stay in it. But how do you help people who feel they've already invested so much in this pathway that to shift away from this pathway would mean that everything that they've done is wasted?
Yeah. And I think that what you just said is the key, is recognizing that everything that you've done is not wasted. You couldn't be doing what you're doing right now if you hadn't done what you did.
100%.
You know, and I did the same thing on a much smaller scale than you, but I started out my career as a special needs teacher. I got a degree in special ed and psychology and taught for a few years, and then decided I wanted to live out my childhood dream of being an animal trainer. And ended up when I told my mom, I'm like, I'm quitting my job as a teacher to go be an animal trainer. She was like, I'm sorry, what? You're doing what? But you know, the things that I learned in that process, and I've done that 3 or 4 more times since then. So my parents have given up on me, basically. They're just happy I don't live in their basement. But, you know, everything I've learned in every single one of those steps has led me to the success I have now. And so I think that's one of the things we need to let go of is, and this goes right back to letting go of one definition of what commitment means, right? When we're committing to a job, it doesn't mean those skills only apply to that job. And being able to understand that those skills are going to translate into the new role. And obviously we're not just leaping and saying, I'm going to go join the circus and I'll make more money than when I was a doctor. Well, okay, let's think about this a little bit. And once we've thought it through, you might come to the conclusion that now this is the right thing for my soul. And I'll be able to take all these skills and all these learnings and all this experience with me into the next place.
I think it's easy. I guess it's easier if you were the one initiating the change, right? So in my context, I initiated the change, but often change happens to people, whether that's a breakup that happens that you didn't see coming, or that you were made redundant from a job that you spent 10 years of your life there. Like, what is your advice for people going through things that maybe they didn't see coming, and how and then being able to quickly adjust to it rather than sort of almost being in a flight or, freeze or in a freeze mode where you like feel like you don't know what to do and you just feel overwhelmed by everything.
Yeah, when we're dropped into a change situation, it's hard because you're like, okay, first of all, I didn't ask for this. I don't want this, and yet here I am. And I think the first step, one of the things I talk about in my keynote speeches is a 3-step process of problem, plan, punch it. And the first one is problem, not what's the problem I need to solve, but what's my problem, and acknowledging those emotions that we talked about earlier. And some of those emotions that don't feel so good, but by acknowledging, I don't like this. We're not going to walk around town saying, I don't like this. This is awful, and shaking our fist at everybody. No, but taking a minute to punch a couch pillow a couple times and say, I don't like this. I'm losing this. Once we acknowledge that, we're able to start thinking about things in a much more logical way. I always say that like denying our emotions is like shoving lava down in a volcano. It only works for so long, right? If we can take a minute and acknowledge those feelings that don't feel so good, we're able to think more logically about the situation and ask the question, and this is one of my favorite questions in these situations, what can I control? Right? What do I have control over? Because there are going to be factors, and you won't like it because it stinks, but there are factors you do not have control over. I have a new boss and I don't like them. We're getting a new computer system. I've been made redundant and moved to a different role. And this is, once you start saying, what can I control? Again, you take back that self-efficacy. You're not the victim anymore. You're saying, okay, cool. I could go in and I could ask some questions and see if I can get some answers around what my future looks like in this situation. I could also leave it. One of the tips that I have in my book is consider the big move. I'm a big fan of the big move. I'm a bigger fan of considering the big move, because when you say, I could leave this and join the circus or enter other reasonable outcome there, I could make a big leap. Then you might say, you know what? I don't want to do that because I really like this job. I like the people that I work with. The commute is very short and I love that. I'm able to be home with my kids a lot faster. Whatever. You start saying, here's why I want to stay. At which point you are then choosing to stay rather than having to stay. And that is a completely different place to be in. So I love saying, okay, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. All right, I don't want to do that. This is staying, this is leaving, this is asking for another role. But when you have that conversation with yourself and look at the options, even the outlandish options, you then make a choice rather than become the victim of your situation.
And, obviously we want to highlight that sometimes having that conversation with yourself might be difficult if you don't have sort of some of the skills that would have developed over time. And so, we want to encourage people to feel that they don't have to do it alone. Obviously, ideally, if you have social networks that you can speak to, whether it's a partner or friends or family, but also, you can speak to professionals, and Clearhead is an EAP provider that has career coaches and mental health professionals that can support you through the grief, through the change and the uncertainty. So this is something that you don't have to suffer alone. And even taking that first step of asking for help, as Anne said, is already that one step that makes you move forward in this process. And
that's another characteristic of a mentally tough person. Is social connection, being willing to ask for help, and those conversations. Angela, I don't know what to do. I was thinking I could do this. I could think, just having those conversations, even if you and I don't solve anything in that moment, things start to crystallize in our head. And pick who you talk to carefully. When you're still trying to figure it out, talking to your partner whose life is emotionally tied to your decision might be not the right, depending on the relationship you have, might be the perfect person to talk to. But while you're still trying to get your own head straight, maybe talking to a friend outside of the situation, or like you said, a professional, when that discomfort is getting to the point where it's getting in the way of functioning well, chat with a professional. Definitely get that help.
Interesting. It reminded me of this podcast episode I once listened to of the lady that developed the Spanx underwear. And she talked about how actually in the first few months of the idea, it was so fragile that she had to carefully pick who she chose to share it with, because people who care about her would probably tell her this is stupid, or, this doesn't seem like it would work out, and probably would have discouraged her in the context of loving and caring for her. So it's really interesting, isn't it? When people almost have a perceived idea of how things should be, they can also influence how stuck you feel in a situation.
It's the same thing that happens in your own brain, right? It's happening in their brain too. Oh my gosh, don't leave your secure job because, you don't know, you're not going to be secure anymore. You don't know what to do. They're trying to protect you, but at the same time, they're limiting you. Yes, there's risk in any move. And some people have a harder time considering that. And it just becomes you might decide the risk is not worth taking, but you want to be considering it in an open situation where you can really think for yourself and feel into yourself and figure out what the right decision for you is.
Along those lines, have you had any learnings around how one can make change or decision that's not influenced heavily by other people, but actually truly by what I guess we fundamentally would be good for us, but maybe we haven't had the chance to build that self-awareness, that self-reflection, and we might be more easily influenced by, as you said, someone who says, oh, this is a good job because it gives you this social status. And so you don't want to give up this social status now, do you? Kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think that is one of the hardest parts about being human because there are a million ways to live life. There are a million ways to do jobs, to do relationships, to do everything. And to live a happy life, you got to figure out what the right way is for you. And it might be different than your mentor, than your favorite parent, than your most beloved, brother or sister. It might be completely different. And so one of the biggest challenges is, how do I make a decision for me separate from all of that social pressure and all of the pieces that come along with being a social human. The part that gets me is really think into when are the times you are feel most alive, feel most excited, feel most energized, and really think about what was I doing at that moment? What was I thinking about? What was I talking about? What lit me up? Because those are the things when you just feel like you can't contain yourself. You're so excited. Those are the things that you should starting to look at and say, hey, that I love that. That does it for me, because that's the stuff that's going to really light your soul on fire, and that can guide you toward those decisions.
That's cool. I think you've given us some very practical ways to think about change, whether it's questions that we could ask ourselves, or sort of systems that we could put in our lives that allows us to kind of consider the change in a positive manner and take the first step. I like to kind of shift maybe in the context of more organizations now, and managers and leaders that operate within these organizations. So one of the things that we've seen quite a bit over the last few months is the level of restructuring or redundancies that are happening. And obviously, as we mentioned before, these often get done to people rather than this is something that they voluntarily put their hands up for. So in the context of being the instigator of change into another person's life, how do you do it in a way that actually allows them to process the change in a healthier or quicker way? What's your advice for HR or managers or leaders around ensuring people transition as smoothly as possible?
Yeah. Trust is, having trust in an organization, having trust in your leadership is a massive piece of being able to effectively and smoothly lead through change. So I always say, if you're starting at the point of change, you're starting too late. Really thinking on a regular basis in all roles of leadership, how do I build trust with my team? Because when we get to that point of change, I'm going to need them to trust me sometimes. I'm going to need them to be able to say, all right, I don't like this, but I trust you, your intentions, your intelligence to think things through, and your willingness to communicate with me when I need information. So that they will just say, okay, cool. I don't like this, but I like you and I trust you. And here we go. Right. So I always say, really think about how do you build trust with your team on a day-to-day basis? And how do you build what I call a culture of open communication so that people can voice their challenges, voice their concerns, share what problems they have with it so you can help them work through it. I worked at Under Armour back in 2002, and I was employee number 80. It was way early times in the company. It was a fun time to be at Under Armour, but we were undergoing a ton of very fast change and growth. And we had a all team meeting, the entire company one time, and they announced that we were having a huge technological upgrade. Big change. We were all going to have to spend days in training and blah, 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 learning. So after that meeting was over, my boss pulled my department into a meeting and he said, okay, complain. And we were all, it was like crickets in there. We were like, you going to complain? I'm not going to complain. Are you going to complain? And we were like,
I've never heard that before.
Totally. And we were like, what are you talking about? He goes, I want to know what your challenges are, what you're worried about, what you don't like. He goes, because there may be something we can fix. There may be something we didn't think about. And there may be something we can alleviate along the way to make it a little bit easier for you. I don't know what it's like to sit in your chair. So tell me, what are you worried about? Because and this was a brilliant move. I thought it was so weird at the moment, but he was creating that culture of open communication, saying, I want to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly. Don't toxic positivity me. This is not all good. Tell me what's wrong. And by doing that, we kind of slowly, he goes, let me tell you what my problem is. And he was like sharing what he was worried about. We were all like, whoa, this is crazy. But then we had a very constructive dialogue because we're going to have that conversation anyway, complaining about the things we're worried about, that we don't like, that we don't agree with, that we think are stupid, right? We're going to have that conversation. He gave us a constructive outlet to
and
say,
probably also a safe space, right? Like
totally. And he was doing it in a very forward and solution focused way, because he was saying, we're not looking at just what's wrong. We're going to look at, can we do something about this? And it was brilliant. Now, as the leader, you've got to be ready to hear the stuff that they say. You've got to be open and empathetic to people's feelings and be willing to say, okay, cool, I get that. There may not be anything you can do about it, but I'm glad I know that, because now I can approach the situation. And if there is something we can do about it, we'll do it. And so it takes a very emotionally intelligent leader to open up that can of worms, but it is an incredible trust builder if it can be done well.
That's super cool. And obviously Under Armour now is like, I think it's 15,000 employees. So for you to be there in the early days, there would have been a lot of like change at that time that you'd have to navigate through. And so you mentioned obviously a key part of building trust in your employees before the big change happens is developing an environment in which people can feel safe to share and have that open dialogue. What is another key thing that you've noticed leaders or companies do to build trust in their employees?
I think teaching people how to communicate well. Actual professional development on communication. We never get that. How do I complain in a constructive way? It's important for me to say, hey, this isn't working for me in my job. I want to be able to hit my goals, hit the company goals, and do the best work I can. But I can't we're never taught how to say that stuff. And when we invest in professional development for our team to be able to deal with communication and conflict and challenges, oh my gosh, it's great because we're saying we want to hear the bad stuff. We know it's there. And if we're blind to it and not teaching you how to constructively do it, your frustration grows. We never know what's wrong. And all of a sudden, the snowflake that used to be at the top of a mountain is now an avalanche taking out our entire city. I mean, so I think that professional development, especially in the, what I call power skills, what people call soft skills like communication, is a great way to facilitate the building of trust and allow people. And I mean, people are suspicious these days. We're worried, we're defensive, we're protective. And, I mean, especially here in the US, I'm not quite sure how it is in New Zealand, but that self-protection is very strong. And so we need a reason to trust. We need that proof. So opening up that dialogue and giving them the skills to be able to do it and then accepting it as a leader is huge.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you. I think that's something that as a leader, I'm actively working on. Be curious to hear your perspective in the context of not just now the leader being receptive and listening to feedback from employees, but often in order to facilitate positive change, it means we have to do things differently. And as you correctly identified, people have increasingly become more and more defensive. And so even if you are providing constructive feedback, it is heard in the context of like, you're bullying me, or, and how do you advise leaders and managers to provide feedback in a way that it is not perceived as bullying and perceived instead as like a way of positive change?
One of the things that I like to tell people as they're moving into a tough conversation, because usually this is where that accusation might be taking place, is to think about it as calling them into a collaborative conversation rather than calling them out for doing something wrong. That shift in our approach changes the interpersonal dynamic that I'm walking into from me being the boss and you being the employee and me telling you what you need to do right to us being two intelligent, mature, professional adults having a conversation so that we can solve a problem, right? When I walk into that conversation with that mindset, it helps, right? Because I'm going to treat the other person like the intelligent, mature adult that they are, okay? The other piece is learning how to listen really well. And to be able to be open to their ideas, to their explanations, to their perspectives. One of the biggest emotional intelligence things that somebody said to me once that blew my mind was, Anne, stop expecting you from other people. We walk into situations where we have to give feedback, have a corrective conversation, like they should know. They should do this. I know where they're coming from and they're wrong, right? But if we approach that situation more like, hey, there's a lot I don't know, and I'm curious about their perspective, it allows us to approach that situation with curiosity rather than animosity and makes a constructive conversation a lot more effective. Also understanding, what's my motivation? Why am I having this conversation? And what is the outcome ultimately that I'm trying to achieve? Because how we get there could be achieved in several different ways. And if we are involving them in the how we get there, as long as we get there, I don't care if it's your way or mine, as long as we get there. And if we're able to listen to their way and take that on, they're much more likely to be engaged in that solution to get us to that final outcome. So a little bit of forethought is really important too.
And this is me sort of thinking out loud in the context that I feel sometimes it's a bit chicken and egg, in the sense that I, as the employee, have to trust you in your process, have to trust the feedback that you're giving me is of the right intention, etc. But if I don't have that trust, then then you can't really have that open conversation with me. And so then without that open conversation, I can't build that trust. It feels very chicken and egg. How do we get to the trust bit if we don't have, maybe we are already in an environment where it is low trust, that, that there is a history of leaders disappointing employees. Like, how do you shift the culture when you have to rebuild trust?
Yeah, some people have really good reasons for not trusting. There's some really bad bosses out there. Your actions are the only thing that will build trust. And often it takes time. And often you have it and you don't even realize it. And and one of the things that I talk to leaders about, that's the most challenging thing about interpersonal communication and dynamics, is that we can never control what the other person does. Okay. I can't control what baggage they're coming in with, what preconceived notions they have about bosses, about how they need to protect them. I can't control any of that. All I can do is control myself and show them that my integrity is strong, that my actions and my intentions are good, and that I'm going to be consistent and back up what I say. And so it takes a lot of self-reflection in the case of a leader to be able to say, am I backing it up? And in today's fast moving world, it's really easy to communicate in a way that builds a wall if we're not intentional about the way that we're communicating. So it takes that self-regulation and paying attention to ourselves to make sure that we're being a trustworthy leader. And that's all we can do, because we can't force somebody to trust us when there's no magic wand that says, bling, we have trust. That would be great. But
wouldn't that make life so much easier for all of us?
Oh man, I'd be a millionaire. But
I think a little bit more than a millionaire.
Yeah, exactly. It would be great, that wand.
I'm actually curious because you sort of mentioned this. You said that in today's world, we actually communicate in a way that builds walls instead of taking them down. Give me examples of how are we unwittingly building walls?
Yeah, sure. Well, we have so many quick ways of communicating, and it's great. We've got instant message. We've got Slack and Teams that we can, just fire off a message. We can text somebody, and we can email from our phones. So we're on the train going home and we can fire off an email. But unfortunately, if we don't already have that, like if I'm interacting with you every day, all day, shooting you an email that says, Angela, need that report Friday. Thanks so much, Anne. You know me. We have a great relationship. It's easy. Okay. No problem. But if I don't have that trust built, we've all had that we've gotten that email where it's like, Anne, need that report Friday. Thanks, Angela. And it's like, whoa, why is she being so cold? Why is she being so mean? Or, yup, somebody sends you a one-word text back and it's like, yup, why are they being so rude? Right? So what we don't realize is how our efficiency is sometimes being misinterpreted. And you can say, oh, they shouldn't take it that way all you want, but the fact is they are. And it's impacting the results that we get, right? So I'm always really careful as I'm communicating with somebody that I don't have that constant back and forth with, that I'm doing what I call adding the fluff. Just, hey, Angela, I hope you're having a great day. Looking forward to seeing that report. If you need any help, let me know. If I could have it Friday, that'd be awesome. Thanks so much for your help. I appreciate it, Anne. Just adding that little bit of fluff to fill in and show my intention so that my intention and my impact match.
And I am absolutely guilty of the said something.
Yeah, right.
So, and that's actually my intention for 2025 is to be so much more careful with my communication, because it is, as you said, it doesn't matter what your intention is, it's how it's being perceived and interpreted. And then you have to then deal with the consequences of how it was then perceived and interpreted. And it's so interesting, isn't it? Because we do kind of demonize small talk, but actually small talk is such a key part of building trust that we we in our efficiency world, we sort of like dismiss it. But I think a lot of it is bringing that relational aspect of being a human back again, like taking the 2 minutes to ask about your kids and how their soccer game went, or taking 2 minutes to go, how was your mom? You said she went to the hospital, right? Like before you sort of go can I have the report? Thanks, bye.
Exactly. And we have to figure out how to do it in an authentic way too. Yeah. Because, if every day you're saying, hi, Angela, how are your children? Okay, great. I look forward to seeing that report. If every day we're doing that, eventually you're going to be like, dude, you don't care about my kids, So we need to figure out how to do that in an authentic way, but without being nosy as well. And it does, you're right, make a complete difference.
Yeah. I guess along those same lines, how do you not do it as a tick box when you talk about open communication and receiving feedback when companies are going through change, that it is not just like a tick the box, this is the process we just have to follow, and actually have companies or leaders really engage in the discussion side of things?
And I think it goes back to that. What am I doing on a day-to-day basis? Because there are going to be moments where you have to tick boxes from a legal standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint. There are going to be some boxes you got to tick, and there's corporate stuff you got to do. But I think it goes back to that day-to-day interaction. Is your team seeing your face? Are you stopping by? Do you stop in to just say, hey, how's it going? Hey, I know you're working on a tough report right now. Is everything coming out okay? Do you need any help? Let me know. It's just being present in the little stuff, I think that makes a huge difference when we get to the big stuff. And again, it's figuring out, how do I do this authentically? What's authentic for me? Because it's going to look different for different people.
But the thing you mentioned before as well is like, okay, you have to undergo this change. You open the forum in which employees could share their feedback about that change. And they came up with some suggestions or things they didn't like that for whatever reason, the company can't action on any of that. I almost feel like it would be worse to have opened that can of worms, give people hope that they've shared their perspective and then you did nothing with it. Like, how do you then deal with the potential negative impact of that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because it is an important piece of that authenticity, right? In that meeting, one of the things my boss said was, you're going to tell me some things and I'm not going to be able to do anything about, and I'm going to tell you that. So it's a matter of not building false hope. It's about saying, I want to hear it. I want to give you a constructive outlet for it. I might not be able to do anything about it. And I might just say, yeah, well, that's terrible. And that's a bad part of this. And so it goes to the leader to be courageously honest and be able to not build that false hope, and be able to be honest and say, look, I'm going to tell you when I can't do something because I don't want to build that false hope. And that follow up is really important too. Don't just have that meeting, listen to them, make them all feel sunshiny and wonderful that you're going to do something and then never get back to them. Even if you did something, they're going to be like, oh, well, never heard from her again, So I think that's another piece of it, is the follow up and the follow through and the courageous honesty when the answer is no. We can't do anything about that. And it's setting the realistic expectation for the team. I think expectations is huge, and that's where transparent communication comes in. If you expect I'm going to, do something by next week, I may be able to do something, but it's not going to happen for 6 months until phase 1 and 2 of this rollout happen. Well, I need to communicate that. And so it takes a lot of thought to make, and this is hard stuff because you're dealing with your own challenges with all this. Now I got to deal with all of them. Welcome to leadership.
I know, right? Like, yeah, often people glamorize this idea of being a leader. I'm like, you don't really want to be a leader if you actually know what goes behind being a leader, actually. It's very interesting. And I guess in some ways, a lot of the discussion we've had about these is in the context of I, the leader, know what to do. And we also spoke about with the pace of change, with the fact that, back in the 50s and 60s, people would have jobs that last them the whole lifetime. And now, you spend 5 years at a job and you've been there for too long. And so often with this term of like what we call VUCA, which is sort of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which is the environment in which a lot of organizations operate in. Like, often as a leader, you also don't even have the answers and you don't even know what to do. How do you lead in a way that builds trust? Because part of the trust has to be, you know what you're doing, so I'm trusting you and I'm following you. But if you don't know what you're doing, like, how do you maintain that trust?
I disagree that part of that trust is you knowing what you're doing. Because oftentimes you don't. I think part of that trust is the vulnerability to say, hey, y'all, I don't know how this is going to turn out. I think we have a good plan. We've thought it through, but there are a couple ways this could go. And I recognize that too. And I think it's also important that your team knows you don't know everything and that you're willing to say, hey, you know what? I don't know. I'm going to see if I can find out and I'm going to get back to you. But I don't know how this is going to go. I don't know if this is the right version. And I think that honesty builds more trust than the I know everything. And being and that's it's a position of strength, right? To be able to say, hey, y'all, this is an ambiguous environment. We don't know how this is going to turn out. I don't know. And there's going to be a certain level of wait and see to this whole thing. And we're in this together. I'm going to get answers to you as quick as I can. And this is part of where the trust comes in, is I need my team to be able to trust that I'm going to give them the information when I can, when I have it, and just relax and do their job and relax in that ambiguity, in that potential volatility. I don't know. But when we have that open communication, they can relax and trust that when I do know, I'm going to share it. It's not a destination. There's no like, I did it, I'm great at this. It's a constant ebb and flow and back and forth with the team, especially during those difficult times, where human brains don't like uncertainty. I was just talking to somebody earlier today, and he's like, how do I help my wife? Her company was just bought. She's been there 20 years and she has no idea what her job is going to be. That kind of ambiguity is terrifying, especially when it's your job and your livelihood. And so as a leader, you really need to be in that vulnerable place to say, hey, I also don't know how this is going to go. And keep that culture of open communication, continue to communicate and share what you can and share what you know when you do.
And as you mentioned, this uncertainty or change is very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And I could imagine it would be even more uncomfortable for, say, people who have a mental health illness like anxiety or depression, or someone who is maybe neurodivergent, who might see the world slightly differently and might not be able to pick up some of the cues that others are using as a form of comfort that things will be okay. What's your advice, I guess, in supporting those who might be more vulnerable to change?
Yeah, self-awareness is huge. If your company has an employee health and employee support program, make sure your whole team knows what resources are available to them. When you talked earlier about not doing it alone, that is a huge piece. Also, bringing your team together in times of these challenges can really help. But making sure that people know what resources are available to them. But also, if you're the one struggling with, these changes and it's impacted by your mental health challenges or neurodivergence or anything, having that self-awareness to say, I need something different in this situation, and seeking that out, having the courage to seek that help out. And if you're in that point where you're like, I don't know if there's something, if I'm having a mental health challenge, all I know is my life is being significantly impacted. It's worth going and asking some questions, asking for some help, looking into some of those resources, because that can really help you get through it when these tactics that work for the, neurotypical brain don't work.
Yeah, there is no shame and in asking for help. We all need it at different points in our lives. And you've mentioned this a few times. You talked about the emotionally intelligent leader that has developed great communication skills. So what does emotionally intelligent leaders even mean? Like, what's your definition that that someone is an emotionally intelligent leader?
Yeah. Emotional intelligence is basically your ability to recognize your own feelings and the feelings of others, and to be able to shift your behavior as a result of those to get different results. Okay. So it's understanding what results am I trying to get with the people in my life, and how do I shift my thinking in order to be able to get the results I want in life, right? Perfect example. When I started my speaking and training career, people come in late all the time. Now, I am one of those people. I got a Swiss watch built into my soul. I can't be late if I try. Like, it takes effort. And I have always been taught, and I have learned and experienced, that being on time is professional, it's respectful, and it means you've got your stuff together. Right. So the first couple of months as I'm doing trainings, people come in late, and I'm thinking, they're really disrespectful. They're unprofessional. They clearly don't have their stuff together. And for the first half hour to an hour of every training session, I would be frustrated and angry and finally I looked at myself in the mirror. I'm like, what's your problem, sweetheart? This is an awful experience. And what I did was I looked at that cognitive triad of our thoughts become our feelings, become our actions, right? And I reversed that and said, okay, what am I thinking about people coming in late? Well, I'm thinking that it's disrespectful, unprofessional, and you clearly don't have your stuff together. And then the key question to help build this self-awareness and this self-regulation is, could there be another explanation? And the answer is, well, yeah, they could have been out talking to the CEO about a new client. They could have been, stuck in a meeting with a new multi-million-dollar client. They could have been on the phone with their kid's oncologist. All way more important than my little change workshop, And so by shifting the thinking, the emotions start to change and our actions start to change. That's how we develop that self-awareness and self-regulation piece of the emotional intelligence. And that's the biggest key piece to being an emotionally intelligent leader, is to be able to handle what's going on here so that you can make your intentions, which usually are golden and good, match the impact you have with the people around you.
Yeah, I guess one final question in the context of change is it possible that you would be great at helping other people navigate change, and yet you are so avoidant of change in your own life, even if you have this self-awareness and this emotionally intelligent perspective of how to lead?
I heard a quote the other day. Somebody said, "Here, take my advice. I'm not using it." Right? It's exactly that, right? It's hard to see the label from the inside of the jar. Sometimes you realize, gosh, I can give everybody great advice about this stuff, but here I am stuck, unable to change the way that I'm interacting with my spouse, or the way that I, relate to my kids, or whatever. So yeah, that's absolutely it. And recognition of that is the first step. Right? When we start to recognize, oh, look, I'm not using my own advice. Then when we start catching that, then we're able to say, okay, cool. Next time I'm in that situation, what am I going to do differently? Then we can start shifting our own situation and thinking about it differently.
That's awesome. Well, we have a closing tradition, which is we ask all our guests what they do to stay well. So what's your one thing to stay well, Anne?
I drink a lot of water. I used to be an endurance athlete. I've run a marathon on every continent. And I recognize the value of hydration in being able to hold it together emotionally. When we're dehydrated, we can't do anything. So I drink a ton of water. I think that's my big one.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? share it with a friend, or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.